As the fires of combat dwindled and the world emerged, battered and changed, from the crucible of World War II, few could foresee that a new and equally consequential conflict awaited. The Cold War, born from the ashes of global war, would shape the destinies of nations, redefine ideologies, and cast a long and chilling shadow over the entire 20th century. It was a conflict fought on every continent, but most acutely in the minds and policies of leaders and citizens alike. A war not of direct clashes, but of perpetual tension, mistrust, and indirect struggle. Its primary actors were the United States of America and the Soviet Union, two nations bound together by victory, yet destined to be separated by ideology, ambition, and their visions for the post-war world. In this comprehensive chronicle, Cold War history, America, the Soviet Union, and the struggle for global supremacy, we traverse the complicated landscape of this era, unraveling the political maneuverings, ideological battles, and proxy confrontations that arose in its wake. The Cold War was not merely a standoff between two nations. It was a global battleground upon which superpowers sought not only territorial advantage, but, crucially, the supremacy of their systems of governance and economic organization. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The End of World War II and the Birth of the Cold War. The conclusion of World War II signaled not a genuine peace for the world, but the germination of new tensions and divisions. The Allied forces, comprised chiefly of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, celebrated the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945. Yet, within the triumphant aftermath lay seeds of discord. The alliance had always been one of necessity, bridged by mutual enemies rather than shared aspirations. With the vanquishing of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the veneer of camaraderie faded, revealing irreconcilable differences in ideology, vision, and strategic interests. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences foreshadowed the unraveling of Allied unity. At these meetings, leaders attempted to chart the course for the post-war world, negotiating terms for the division of Germany, the fate of Eastern Europe, and the reconstruction of war-torn regions. The implicit tug-of-war over influence became ever more explicit. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the war in terms of military and civilian casualties, emerged determined to secure its borders and guarantee aggrandizement. Joseph Stalin pursued the creation of buffer states in Eastern Europe to protect Soviet interests, viewing Western policies with deep suspicion. Conversely, the United States leadership under President Harry S. Truman envisioned a world governed by democratic principles and open markets. American policymakers were wary of Soviet expansionism and the possibility of communism spreading across the continent. As European cities lay in ruins and power structures in flux, the two superpowers sought to mold the international order in their own image. The initial seeds of discord were sown in Poland's fate, with the Soviets imposing a pro-communist regime despite Western advocacy for free elections. This pattern repeated itself throughout Eastern Europe, where Soviet-backed governments replaced those that might have leaned toward the West. Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, a metaphor swiftly adopted to describe the political and physical divisions crystallizing between East and West. Economic factors compounded the rivalry. The United States, untouched in its homeland by the destruction of war, emerged with unmatched industrial capacity and resources. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union leveraged its dominance over Eastern Europe to exert economic control, setting up systems of reparations and resource extraction. The division of Germany, culminating in the establishment of zones of occupation, became the most visible battleground, foreshadowing the eventual crisis in Berlin. Spycraft and intelligence operations flourished. The rapid demobilization of wartime alliances converted into the ramping up of espionage and clandestine maneuvers. Each side sought technological, military, and strategic superiority, while grappling with the terrifying prospect that future wars could be even more catastrophic, especially with the dawn of nuclear weaponry. Thus, the birth of the Cold War was marked by a complex tapestry of political calculation, ideological fervor, and mutual suspicion. The fragile bonds formed in wartime snapped under the weight of post-war realities, unleashing a new era in which adversarial posturing, coalition building, and the relentless pursuit of influence would dominate global affairs for the next 4 decades. The hope for enduring peace gave way to an era defined by anxiety, preparation for conflict, and universal uncertainty. Chapter 2: Ideological Divide. Capitalism versus Communism. At the core of the Cold War was an ideological divide, a fundamental clash of worldviews embodied by the two superpowers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. These differing beliefs were not merely abstract theories. They shaped economies, societies, and international relations. Capitalism, as promoted by the United States, was rooted in principles of private ownership, individual liberty, democratic governance, and market-driven prosperity. The American narrative emphasized personal freedom, entrepreneurship, and the pursuit of happiness through economic opportunity. The political structure favored representative democracy, pluralism, and the protection of civil liberties. In stark contrast, the Soviet Union espoused communism based on the teachings of Marx and Lenin. The state dominated all facets of economic life, abolishing private property in favor of collective ownership. The communist blueprint was one of social equality pursued through central planning, strict party control, and suppression of dissent. Stalin's government maintained that only through a vanguard party, revolutionary discipline, and the abolition of class hierarchies could humanity achieve genuine emancipation. These opposing systems spilled into the public consciousness through propaganda, education, and culture. American films, literature, and media projected the virtues of democracy and free enterprise, often depicting Soviet society as repressive and dangerous. Conversely, Soviet culture championed collectivism, worker heroism, and the achievements of planned economies, portraying the West as decadent and exploitative. The ideological divide was not self-contained. It actively shaped foreign policy. The United States feared that communism's spread would destabilize existing political systems, undermine economic freedoms, and lead to totalitarianism. Strategies such as containment, articulated famously by George Kennan, sought to limit Soviet expansion and influence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, viewed American policies as aggressive and imperialist, accusing the West of orchestrating efforts to encircle and suffocate socialism. Within this setting, the polarization of the world accelerated. Both superpowers exported their ideologies through aid, pressure, and intervention. The United States assisted countries resisting communist subversion, supporting governments in Western Europe, Latin America, and Asia. The Soviet Union extended its model through Comecon and directed support to progressive governments in developing nations and revolutionary movements worldwide. The ideological struggle further entrenched the division of Europe. Institutions such as the Cominform and the CIA, doctrines such as the Truman Doctrine, and events like the Berlin Blockade exemplify the tangible deployment of ideals. Education, art, and scientific collaboration were similarly transformed into arenas for contesting narratives. Ultimately, the Cold War's ideological battleground created pervasive insecurity. Each side believed the fate of humanity rested on the triumph of its system. This not only made compromise difficult, but dangerously elevated the stakes of every local conflict and diplomatic encounter. The world's future was seen through the prism of a duel between capitalism and communism, a duel that shaped economies, alliances, and the psychological climate of the global population. Chapter 3. The Iron Curtain descends over Europe. One of the most striking metaphors of the Cold War era was the Iron Curtain, a term famously coined by Winston Churchill in his 1946 speech at Fulton, Missouri. Churchill warned that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This image captured the growing division of Europe, literal, political, and psychological. The Iron Curtain was not a tangible wall at first, but a line splitting the continent. On one side lay Western democracies, supported by the United States and its allies, striving for political pluralism and economic recovery through free market policies. On the other was Eastern Europe, where pro-Soviet regimes emerged under the watchful influence of Moscow. The rapid establishment of communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and the German Democratic Republic testified to the effectiveness of Soviet coercion and political engineering. Elections were staged, opposition suppressed, and local communist parties propelled into power by Soviet army presence. Secret police forces became a staple of life, rooting out resistance and enforcing conformity. The division was soon physically expressed. Border closures, barbed wire, and strict travel restrictions made movement between East and West perilous or impossible. Families found themselves divided, economies disrupted, and traditions severed. Western Europeans viewed the curtained lands as lost to totalitarianism, while in the East, official narratives emphasized security, anti-fascism, and the construction of a socialist utopia. Berlin, the former German capital, became the most visible symbol of the partition. The city was itself divided into 4 sectors controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the USSR. As political pressure mounted and relations deteriorated, Berlin transformed into the focal point for confrontation, intelligence operations, and the competing ambitions of the superpowers. The Iron Curtain's legacy extended beyond geography. It shaped mentalities. Eastern European societies braced for conformity, facing censorship, surveillance, and shortages. The West experienced both relief at escaping Soviet dominance and anxiety over the growing threat from the East. The curtain was a psychological barrier, propagating myths, fears, and a powerful sense of otherness on both sides. This division also influenced the global stage. Disputes over Germany, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean exacerbated rivalries. The Marshall Plan's rollout and Soviet response further deepened this chasm. In seeking absolute security, both sides erected structures that rigidified the divide and made reconciliation increasingly elusive. The Iron Curtain did not merely separate territories, it redefined the very concept of nationhood, alliances, and destiny for millions. Its descent was not instantaneous but progressive, shaped by practical necessities, ideological commitments, and spiraling mistrust. The curtain's eventual physical manifestation, the Berlin Wall in 1961, would later symbolize the Cold War's cruelty and its near-permanent nature. For decades, the Iron Curtain stood as both a reality and a metaphor, reminding the world of deep-seated ideological, political, and human divisions. Its ultimate lifting decades later would mark the end of the Cold War, but the shadows it cast lingered long after. Chapter 4. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The emergence of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan marked a decisive shift in American foreign policy and established the framework for Cold War confrontation. As Europe lay devastated by war, the prospect of economic collapse, political instability, and communist insurrection loomed. The United States, prompted by concerns over Soviet ambitions and ideological expansion, recognized the need for comprehensive action. The Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry S. Truman in March 1947, declared a policy of providing economic and military assistance to countries threatened by communism. Its immediate impetus was the crisis in Greece and Turkey, where civil war and Soviet pressure jeopardized pro-Western governments. The doctrine advocated containment, a strategy to prevent the spread of communism to vulnerable states. It signified the American commitment to intervene wherever communist expansion threatened, reshaping diplomacy from isolationism to active engagement. Truman's speech to Congress framed the struggle as one of global significance, a battle between free peoples and totalitarian regimes. His appeal resonated with policymakers who feared a domino effect, whereby communist victories in one country could trigger revolutions in others. The doctrine quickly became the foundation for numerous interventions, signaling to allies that the United States would act as the bulwark against Soviet influence. Economic recovery became as crucial as military support. In 1948, Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled the European Recovery Program, widely known as the Marshall Plan. This initiative offered substantial financial aid to Western European countries, enabling them to rebuild infrastructure, revive economies, and restore stability. The plan was revolutionary in its scope, distributing over $13 billion to 16 nations, fostering cooperation, and laying the groundwork for European integration. The Soviet reaction to these measures was swift and hostile. The USSR denounced the Marshall Plan as an instrument of American imperialism, discouraging Eastern European nations from participation and solidifying the division of the continent. The Soviets introduced their own counter-initiatives, such as Comecon, seeking to bind their sphere economically to Moscow. The impact of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan was profound. Western Europe experienced rapid reconstruction, rising prosperity, and the consolidation of democratic institutions. The United States cemented its leadership role in the Western Bloc, while the Soviet Union intensified its control over Eastern satellites. The rivalry became increasingly structured, with alliances and interdependencies deepening on both sides. The doctrines also reshaped the global order, influencing political developments in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. American aid became a tool for exercising influence and gaining loyalty, while Soviet-backed revolutions and economic partnerships reflected parallel ambitions. This competition frequently played out in proxy conflicts, local insurgencies, and diplomatic tug-of-war. In retrospect, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were pivotal in thwarting the appeal and spread of communism in Western Europe. They achieved more than immediate recovery. They fostered long-term resilience, emboldened American foreign policy, and framed the ideological confrontation that would define world affairs for a generation. Their legacies endure, reminding us that economic aid and political will can be as decisive in shaping history as battles and treaties. Chapter 4. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The emergence of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan marked a decisive shift in American foreign policy and established the framework for Cold War confrontation. As Europe lay devastated by war, the prospect of economic collapse, political instability, and communist insurrection loomed. The United States, prompted by concerns over Soviet ambitions and ideological expansion, recognized the need for comprehensive action. The Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry S. Truman in March 1947, declared a policy of providing economic and military assistance to countries threatened by communism. Its immediate impetus was the crisis in Greece and Turkey, where civil war and Soviet pressure jeopardized pro-Western governments. The doctrine advocated containment, a strategy to prevent the spread of communism to vulnerable states. It signified the American commitment to intervene wherever communist expansion threatened, reshaping diplomacy from isolationism to active engagement. Truman's speech to Congress framed the struggle as one of global significance, a battle between free peoples and totalitarian regimes. His appeal resonated with policymakers who feared a domino effect, whereby communist victories in one country could trigger revolutions in others. The doctrine quickly became the foundation for numerous interventions, signaling to allies that the United States would act as the bulwark against Soviet influence. Economic recovery became as crucial as military support. In 1948, Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled the European Recovery Program, widely known as the Marshall Plan. This initiative offered substantial financial aid to Western European countries, enabling them to rebuild infrastructure, revive economies, and restore stability. The plan was revolutionary in its scope, distributing over $13 billion to 16 nations, fostering cooperation and laying the groundwork for European integration. The Soviet reaction to these measures was swift and hostile. The USSR denounced the Marshall Plan as an instrument of American imperialism, discouraging Eastern European nations from participation and solidifying the division of the continent. The Soviets introduced their own counter-initiatives, such as Comecon, seeking to bind their sphere economically to Moscow. The impact of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan was profound. Western Europe experienced rapid reconstruction, rising prosperity, and the consolidation of democratic institutions. The United States cemented its leadership role in the Western Bloc, while the Soviet Union intensified its control over Eastern satellites. The rivalry became increasingly structured, with alliances and interdependencies deepening on both sides. The doctrines also reshaped the global order, influencing political developments in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. American aid became a tool for exercising influence and gaining loyalty, while Soviet-backed revolutions and economic partnerships reflected parallel ambitions. This competition frequently played out in proxy conflicts, local insurgencies, and diplomatic tug-of-war. In retrospect, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were pivotal in thwarting the appeal and spread of communism in Western Europe. They achieved more than immediate recovery. They fostered long-term resilience, emboldened American foreign policy, and framed the ideological confrontation that would define world affairs for a generation. Their legacies endure, reminding us that economic aid and political will can be as decisive in shaping history as battles and treaties. Chapter 6: The Nuclear Arms Race, Fear and Deterrence. As diplomatic tensions escalated throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, a new and terrifying dimension of the Cold War emerged: the nuclear arms race. The development, stockpiling, and threatened use of nuclear weapons became the central aspect of superpower rivalry. Introducing the doctrine of deterrence, transforming military doctrine, and casting a shadow of existential fear over global society. The United States, the first to develop and deploy atomic bombs in 1945, initially possessed an unchallenged nuclear monopoly. However, the Soviet Union, spurred by espionage and intensive research, detonated its first atomic device in August 1949. The race rapidly accelerated, with each side seeking to build warheads, delivery systems, and vast arsenals capable of catastrophic destruction. The stakes escalated with the advent of thermonuclear weapons. The United States tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1952, achieving yields far beyond the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union followed soon after, and both powers embarked on a relentless arms buildup, producing thousands of warheads, ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. Military doctrines shifted to embrace the concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, a situation in which any nuclear attack would provoke an annihilating counterattack, rendering victory impossible and war unthinkable. This grim calculus maintained an uneasy peace, preventing direct conflict but intensifying fear and uncertainty. Civil defense measures proliferated in both countries, reflecting anxiety about the possibility of nuclear holocaust. Technological innovation went hand in hand with strategic planning. Missile development, particularly the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, transformed military balances. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles further complicated the calculus, making second strike capabilities effectively unstoppable. Public consciousness was profoundly altered. The threat of nuclear annihilation entered popular culture, education, and daily life. Films, literature, and art reflected the pervasive dread, while movements for disarmament began to gain traction in the face of mounting risk. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Governments constructed fallout shelters, and scientists warned of the ecological and human consequences of atomic war. The arms race also influenced diplomacy. Crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, demonstrated the perilous brinkmanship inherent in nuclear competition, while subsequent arms control agreements, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968, and later SALT and START talks sought to manage and limit the threat. Yet, the spiraling expenditure of resources on nuclear weapons came at enormous financial, social, and moral cost. The diversion of funds from productive uses, the environmental impact of testing, and the psychological toll of perpetual fear marked the nuclear era as one of profound danger. In conclusion, the nuclear arms race defined the Cold War's second phase, introducing an unprecedented threat and fundamentally shaping the strategies, mentalities, and policies of superpowers and their citizens. Deterrence prevented confrontation, but ensured that peace remained deeply fragile and conditional, a peace resting on the edge of annihilation. Chapter 7: The Rise of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The aftermath of World War II left Europe fractured and vulnerable, with much of the continent in ruins and its infrastructure devastated. As the victorious Allied powers grappled with reconstruction and peace, a new ideological rift swiftly emerged. The alliance of convenience between the United States and the Soviet Union dissolved, revealing profound differences in political and economic philosophies. Two visions for the future competed: Western democracy and capitalism versus Eastern communism and autocracy. At the heart of this divide lay the question of security. The United States, now a true global power, sought to prevent the rise of another aggressive adversary and to sustain the fragile peace. Western European nations, beleaguered by war and, under the looming shadow of Soviet influence, welcomed American leadership and support. In accordance, talks began which would ultimately result in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Founded on April 4, 1949, NATO was more than a military alliance. It was a commitment to collective defense, enshrined in Article 5, stipulating that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. 12 nations initially signed the treaty, pledging to safeguard each other against external threats, particularly those posed by the Soviet Union and its growing sphere of influence. The strategic logic was clear: deter Soviet aggression and underscore American engagement in European security. The Soviet Union perceived NATO as a direct challenge to its interests and a vehicle for Western expansion. Tensions heightened as NATO grew to incorporate additional members, further encircling Soviet bloc countries. Concerned that its satellite nations in Eastern Europe might drift toward the West, the USSR sought a counterbalance. In 1955, the Soviet Union formalized its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact unified the military forces of Soviet-aligned countries in Eastern Europe, providing a platform for joint defense and coordination. It stands as a mirror image to NATO, both in structure and intent, cementing the polarization of Europe. However, the Warsaw Pact was distinct in its hierarchical nature. While NATO members retained a degree of autonomy, Warsaw Pact states were tightly controlled by Moscow, reflecting the Soviet imperative to maintain dominance over its bloc. The rise of these alliances transformed Europe into a continent of fortified borders and ideological frontiers. The infamous Iron Curtain divided East from West, not only geographically, but also culturally and politically. Barbed wire, minefields, and watchtowers marked the division, serving both as physical deterrents and as powerful symbols of the era's antagonism. NATO and the Warsaw Pact institutionalized the Cold War, making the confrontation systematic and enduring. The presence of vast armies, advanced weaponry, and nuclear arsenals on both sides meant that any conflict risked escalation to catastrophic proportions. Yet paradoxically, this balance of power, known as mutually assured destruction, MAD, functioned as a deterrent against direct confrontation. Diplomatic efforts, such as arms control negotiations and confidence-building measures, periodically attempted to ease tensions. However, the alliances remained locked in mutual suspicion, and their existence shaped virtually all aspects of international relations during the Cold War. Periodic crises in Berlin, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia underscored the dangers inherent in the system, demonstrating that while the alliances prevented all-out war, they could not eliminate local conflicts or internal dissent. In summary, the rise of NATO and the Warsaw Pact defined the geopolitical landscape of post-war Europe, laying the foundation for decades of strategic competition. These alliances influenced military planning, political discourse, and popular perceptions, setting the stage for the Cold War's most significant confrontations and guiding the destinies of nations on both sides of the divide. Chapter 8: The Korean War, a proxy battle of superpowers. As Cold War tensions crystallized with the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, a flashpoint emerged on the Korean Peninsula, a stage for superpower rivalry mediated through proxy conflict. Korea, previously under Japanese rule, was liberated in 1945 by Allied forces and subsequently partitioned along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union administered the North, installing a communist regime under Kim Il-sung. The United States oversaw the South, supporting a government led by Syngman Rhee. Rooted in Republican ideology, both North and South Korea aspired to unify the country under their respective systems, but their ambitions were constrained by the global order. The superpowers' endorsement made war a perilous gamble, yet the simmering hostilities could not be perpetually contained. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a surprise invasion across the 38th parallel, aiming to reunify Korea under communism. The incursion transformed Korea into the first major battleground of the Cold War. The United States swiftly mobilized, leading a United Nations coalition to defend South Korea. The operation symbolized the policy of containment, America's determination to prevent communist expansion wherever it appeared. US forces, along with British, Australian, Canadian, Turkish, and other Allied troops, initially faced dire circumstances. The North's advance pushed to the southern tip of the peninsula, threatening total collapse. In a dramatic reversal, General Douglas MacArthur masterminded the Incheon landing, turning the tide and launching a counter-offensive that pushed deep into North Korea. Emboldened, UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River, approaching the Chinese border. Perceiving an existential threat, China intervened, deploying hundreds of thousands of volunteer troops to stave off North Korea's defeat. The conflict escalated, drawing in greater resources and amplifying destruction. Fierce battles raged, epitomized by the brutal fighting at the Chosun Reservoir and elsewhere. The confrontation signaled to the world that the Cold War could erupt into open warfare, involving major powers despite the risks of escalation. The Korean War's diplomatic dimensions were as significant as its military aspects. Negotiations for an armistice dragged on for 2 years, highlighting the intransigence and suspicion between the adversaries. Both sides engaged in psychological warfare, propaganda, and efforts to sway global opinion. The conflict ended in 1953 with an armistice rather than a peace treaty, leaving Korea divided and tense, a status quo that persists today. The Korean War cost millions of lives, wrought vast devastation, and reshaped the geopolitical landscape. It established the precedent for proxy wars, wherein superpowers provided backing and direction, but refrained from direct confrontation, wary of nuclear escalation. The war profoundly affected U.S. foreign and military policy, affirming the commitment to global containment and generating support for dramatic expansions of defense budgets and alliances. For the Soviet Union and China, the Korean conflict showcased the necessity of solidarity and coordination when defending communist interests. It spurred military modernization and fostered enduring distrust toward the United States and its allies. Meanwhile, the armistice created the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a symbol of unresolved conflict and ideological division. Ultimately, the Korean War demonstrated that the struggle for influence during the Cold War would not be confined to Europe. It illuminated the willingness of both sides to risk escalation, expend resources, and seek advantage in regions far beyond their own borders. Korea stands as a chilling reminder of how ideological rivalry can devastate nations, separating families, communities, and generations in the service of global power politics. Chapter 9. Espionage and Secrets, the CIA versus the KGB. Beneath the overt military and diplomatic confrontations of the Cold War lay an equally intense struggle hidden from public view. The clandestine operations conducted by the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, of the United States and the Committee for State Security, KGB, of the Soviet Union spearheaded campaigns of espionage, counterintelligence, and covert action that influenced the course of history. The establishment of the CIA in 1947 heralded a new era in American intelligence, consolidating the disparate wartime agencies into a formidable organization tasked with gathering information, analyzing threats, and orchestrating secret interventions abroad. Its Soviet adversary, the KGB, emerged as the linchpin of the USSR's internal and external security apparatus, combining domestic surveillance with foreign intelligence gathering. Espionage during the Cold War encompassed far more than spycraft. It involved political manipulation, psychological operations, and sabotage. Both agencies deployed spies deep within enemy territory, seeking to recruit officials, penetrate military programs, and uncover strategic intentions. High-profile cases, such as the infiltration of British intelligence by the Cambridge Five and the defection of Soviet agents like Oleg Gordievsky, underscored the stakes and sophistication of operations on both sides. Technological innovation played a pivotal role. The CIA and KGB raced to develop surveillance satellites, electronic listening devices, and cryptographic tools. Operations such as the U-2 reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory and the deployment of honeypots to ensnare diplomats and scientists exemplified their resourcefulness. Intelligence failures, like the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960, led to international crises and altered the course of diplomatic negotiations. A key feature of Cold War espionage was the use of active measures. The KGB specialized in disinformation, campaigns designed to destabilize Western societies, erode trust in institutions, and influence political outcomes. The CIA employed similar tactics abroad, seeking to undermine communist movements, support friendly regimes, and instigate revolts. Notable examples include CIA involvement in the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, and the KGB's role in backing leftist insurgencies in Africa and Latin America. The intelligence struggle extended to the scientific realm. Both agencies competed ferociously to steal technological secrets, particularly in nuclear and missile development. The acquisition of atomic espionage by figures like Klaus Fuchs enabled the rapid advancement of Soviet nuclear capabilities, narrowing the gap between the superpowers and intensifying the arms race. Espionage shaped the psychological landscape of the Cold War. Fear of infiltration, betrayal and subversion fostered suspicion within governments and societies. The search for moles and double agents became a defining feature of intelligence work, fueling purges, witch hunts, and internal paranoia. Mass media and fiction, such as James Bond novels and films, popularized the secret world of spies, embedding it in public consciousness. Ultimately, the rivalry between the CIA and the KGB was a contest for information, influence, and security. While each achieved notable successes and suffered dramatic failures, their operations deeply affected the policies and actions of their respective superpowers. Intelligence shaped the decisions that led to or averted crises, determined the success of interventions, and ensured that much of the Cold War was fought in the shadows. The legacy of their competition is a cautionary tale about the power and peril of secrets in international affairs. Chapter 10: The Space Race, from Sputnik to the Moon Landing. The struggle for global influence during the Cold War extended into the final frontier, where the United States and the Soviet Union competed to achieve unprecedented feats of science and exploration. The space race, which unfolded between the late 1950s and the early 1970s, embodied the technological rivalry of the era and became a defining chapter in human history. The origins of the space race can be traced to the development of rocket technology during World War II. By the early 1950s, both superpowers recognized that mastery of space would confer enormous strategic advantages. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world with the launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The event marked a watershed moment, igniting fears in the United States of falling behind militarily and technologically. Sputnik's success was quickly followed by Sputnik 2, which carried the first living creature, the dog Laika, into space. The Soviet achievements galvanized American efforts to accelerate research and development, leading to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958. The race was now in full swing, as both nations sought to prove the superiority of their scientific models and political systems. The space race was a battleground for propaganda, prestige, and innovation. The Soviet Union racked up early victories. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, cementing Soviet leadership in space exploration. Ensuing missions pushed the boundaries of endurance, technology, and navigation. American resolve was tested, but the challenge inspired a surge of investment and ambition. President John F. Kennedy's 1961 pledge to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade rallied American scientists, engineers, and astronauts. The Mercury and Gemini programs laid the groundwork for advancements in space travel, life support systems, and mission planning. Both superpowers raced to perfect rocket designs. The Soviet N-1 and American Saturn V became symbols of national pride and technological prowess. The Apollo program represented the climax of the space race. After years of setbacks and tragedies, including the loss of Apollo 1's crew in a cabin fire, perseverance paid off. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the lunar surface, fulfilling Kennedy's vision and capturing global attention. The moon landing was broadcast live, a triumph of science, teamwork, and human curiosity. While the Soviet Union achieved remarkable milestones, it ultimately did not match the singular accomplishment of Apollo 11. Nevertheless, the space race drove innovations in computers, telecommunications, materials science, and countless other fields. It fostered international cooperation, exemplified later by joint missions such as Apollo-Soyuz, and demonstrated that peaceful competition could yield benefits for all mankind. The space race also reflected the broader contest for hearts and minds. Scientific achievement was intertwined with ideological rivalry, as each superpower sought to present its system as the path to progress. School children, policymakers, and citizens watched the skies, inspired by visions of a future shaped by knowledge and exploration. In the end, the space race left a legacy far greater than technological milestones. It symbolized humanity's capacity for wonder, ambition, and ingenuity, and served as a reminder that even in the darkest periods of confrontation, the pursuit of discovery could unite rather than divide. Chapter 11. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days to the Brink of War, October 1962, witnessed one of the most perilous moments in human history, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear disaster during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This episode was the ultimate expression of Cold War brinkmanship, a test of will and strategy that shaped the trajectory of global security. The crisis's roots lie in the sweeping changes throughout Latin America, particularly the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which displaced the pro-American regime of Fulgencio Batista and installed a communist government under Fidel Castro. Resentful of U.S. efforts to isolate and undermine Cuba, Castro sought closer ties with the Soviet Union. Premier Nikita Khrushchev viewed Cuba's proximity to American shores as an opportunity to counter NATO missiles deployed in Turkey and Italy, and to alter the strategic balance. In the summer of 1962, Soviet technicians secretly constructed missile sites in Cuba, capable of launching nuclear warheads at major cities throughout the United States. U.S. reconnaissance discovered the installations in mid-October, prompting President John F. Kennedy to convene his advisors in a tense deliberation that would become legendary as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. For 13 days, Kennedy and Khrushchev maneuvered across a landscape fraught with peril. Military leaders advocated immediate airstrikes, risking escalation to full-scale war. Diplomats and intelligence officials counseled restraint, aware that confrontation could annihilate millions. Kennedy ultimately chose a naval quarantine blockade of Cuba, halting further shipments of Soviet weaponry and demanding removal of the missiles. The world watched as American and Soviet forces clashed in words and posturing. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. U.S. forces were placed on DEFCON 2 readiness, one step below nuclear war, and unintentional incidents threatened to spark conflict. A U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, heightening tensions. Behind closed doors, back-channel negotiations unfolded. Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin crafted a solution. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles under UN supervision, while the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba and remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession kept secret at the time. On October 28th, Khrushchev publicly announced the withdrawal, easing fears and restoring an uneasy peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a landmark in crisis management and a vivid demonstration of the extreme risks posed by nuclear arsenals. It prompted the establishment of direct communication channels, the hotline between Washington and Moscow, enabling rapid consultation. Both superpowers began to re-examine the logic of deterrence and escalation, leading to the first arms control agreements, such as the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Politically, the crisis underscored the limits of military power and the necessity of negotiation. It highlighted the importance of intelligence, resolve, and prudence on both sides. For ordinary people, it was a moment of existential fear, forcing a reckoning with the realities of nuclear war. Most importantly, the Cuban Missile Crisis showed that even at the height of antagonism, reason could prevail. The aftermath shaped subsequent diplomacy and led to a more cautious approach to superpower confrontation, even as competition continued on other fronts. Chapter 12: The Vietnam War. America's struggle against communism. The Vietnam War stands as one of the most divisive and consequential conflicts in American history. A protracted and bloody engagement that not only reshaped Southeast Asia, but also profoundly impacted American society and its place in the world. Embroiled in the broader context of the Cold War, the war in Vietnam became a key battleground in the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for global influence. America's involvement, initially framed as a noble effort to contain the spread of communism, gradually escalated into a quagmire that exposed the limitations of American power and the complexities of intervening in foreign conflicts. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the French colonial period, when Vietnam was part of French Indochina. Following World War II, Vietnamese nationalists, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought independence from French rule. Ho Chi Minh, a committed communist, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945, igniting a conflict with France that would last for nearly a decade. The United States, initially hesitant to intervene, gradually increased its support for France, fearing that a communist victory in Vietnam would have a domino effect throughout Southeast Asia. The 1954 Geneva Accords, intended to bring an end to the First Indochina War, divided Vietnam into two separate states: North Vietnam, under the communist leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. However, the accords also called for nationwide elections to reunify the country, a provision that Diem, with American backing, refused to implement, fearing a communist victory. This refusal set the stage for the Second Indochina War, also known as the Vietnam War. The United States' involvement in Vietnam deepened throughout the 1960s, driven by the domino theory and the belief that containing communism was essential to American security. President John F. Kennedy increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam and authorized covert operations against North Vietnam. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the war dramatically, deploying hundreds of thousands of American troops to South Vietnam and launching sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. The Vietnam War became a brutal and unconventional conflict, characterized by guerrilla warfare, jungle combat, and the use of devastating weapons such as napalm and Agent Orange. The war claimed the lives of millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers, as well as over 58,000 American soldiers. The war also had a profound impact on American society, fueling anti-war protests, exacerbating social divisions, and eroding trust in the government. As the war dragged on, the American public grew increasingly disillusioned with the conflict. Anti-war protests erupted on college campuses and in cities across the country, demanding an end to American involvement. The media played a crucial role in shaping public opinion, exposing the brutality of the war and challenging the government's narrative. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a major military campaign launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shattered the illusion of American progress and further fueled anti-war sentiment. In 1969, President Richard Nixon began a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting. However, the war continued for several more years, with heavy casualties on both sides. In 1973, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam, officially ending American involvement in the war. However, the peace agreement proved to be short-lived. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive, capturing Saigon and reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. The fall of Saigon marked a humiliating defeat for the United States and a turning point in the Cold War. The Vietnam War had a lasting impact on American foreign policy, leading to a period of introspection and a greater reluctance to intervene in foreign conflicts. Chapter 13, The Global Cold War, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. While the Cold War was primarily a geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, its impact extended far beyond the borders of these two superpowers. Africa, Asia, and Latin America became key battlegrounds in this global contest for influence, as both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to align newly independent nations and developing countries with their respective ideological blocs. These regions became theaters of proxy conflicts, economic competition, and ideological warfare, with devastating consequences for their populations. In Africa, the Cold War played out against the backdrop of decolonization, as newly independent nations struggled to forge their own paths in a world dominated by the superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence by providing economic aid, military assistance, and political support to various African governments and liberation movements. This competition often exacerbated existing tensions and fueled internal conflicts, as different factions aligned themselves with either the United States or the Soviet Union. The Angolan Civil War, which began in 1975, is a prime example of how the Cold War played out in Africa. The war pitted the Soviet-backed People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, against the United States-backed National Union for Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. The conflict drew in other regional powers, such as Cuba and South Africa, and became a protracted and bloody struggle that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Angolans. In Asia, the Cold War intensified existing regional conflicts and fueled new ones. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was a direct result of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war pitted North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, against South Korea, backed by the United States and the United Nations. The war ended in a stalemate, with the Korean peninsula divided along the 38th parallel, but it had a profound impact on the region, solidifying the Cold War divide in Asia. The Vietnam War, as discussed in the previous chapter, was another major conflict in Asia that was deeply intertwined with the Cold War. The United States' involvement in Vietnam was driven by the domino theory and the fear that a communist victory in Vietnam would lead to the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. The war had a devastating impact on Vietnam and the region, and it also had a profound impact on American society. In Latin America, the Cold War played out in the context of long-standing economic inequalities and political instability. The United States, viewing Latin America as its backyard, sought to maintain its dominance in the region by supporting friendly governments and suppressing leftist movements. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, sought to undermine American influence by supporting revolutionary movements and providing economic and military assistance to anti-American regimes. The Cuban Revolution, which began in 1959, was a major turning point in the Cold War in Latin America. The revolution, led by Fidel Castro, overthrew the US-backed Batista regime and established a communist government in Cuba. The United States responded with a trade embargo and supported various attempts to overthrow Castro, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as the United States and the Soviet Union clashed over the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Throughout Latin America, the United States supported right-wing dictatorships and military juntas that were committed to suppressing communism and maintaining American influence. These regimes often engaged in widespread human rights abuses, including torture, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances. The United States' support for these regimes undermined its credibility as a champion of democracy and human rights and fueled anti-American sentiment in the region, the Cold War had a profound and lasting impact on Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It exacerbated existing conflicts, fueled new ones, and undermined efforts to promote economic development and political stability. The legacy of the Cold War continues to shape the political landscape of these regions today, as many countries grapple with the consequences of decades of proxy warfare, economic exploitation, and political interference. Chapter 14: Propaganda and the Battle for Hearts and Minds. The Cold War was not just a military and political struggle. It was also a battle for hearts and minds. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the importance of shaping public opinion, both at home and abroad, to advance their respective ideologies and gain support for their Cold War policies. Propaganda became a key weapon in this battle, used to demonize the enemy, promote one's own values, and mobilize support for the Cold War agenda. The United States and the Soviet Union employed a wide range of propaganda techniques to influence public opinion. These included films, books, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and cultural exchanges. Both countries invested heavily in these efforts, recognizing that shaping perceptions was crucial to winning the Cold War. American propaganda often emphasized the virtues of democracy, freedom, and capitalism, contrasting them with the perceived evils of communism, totalitarianism, and state control. The United States Information Agency, USIA, established in 1953, played a key role in disseminating American propaganda around the world. The USIA produced films, television programs, and publications that promoted American values and portrayed the United States as a beacon of freedom and prosperity. American propaganda also focused on exposing the shortcomings of the Soviet system, highlighting human rights abuses, economic inefficiencies, and the lack of political freedom. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, both funded by the US government, broadcast news and information to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, providing an alternative to state-controlled media. Soviet propaganda, on the other hand, emphasized the virtues of communism, equality and social justice, contrasting them with the perceived evils of capitalism, exploitation, and inequality. Soviet propaganda portrayed the United States as a warmongering imperialist power that was oppressing the working class and exploiting the developing world. Soviet propaganda also focused on exposing the shortcomings of the American system, highlighting racial discrimination, poverty, and the excesses of consumerism. The Soviet Union used cultural exchanges and sporting events to showcase its achievements and promote its ideology. The battle for hearts and minds was particularly intense in the developing world, where both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to win over newly independent nations and align them with their respective blocs. Both countries offered economic aid, military assistance, and political support to these countries, often using propaganda to portray themselves as the best partner for development and progress. Propaganda played a significant role in shaping public perceptions of the Cold War. In the United States, it helped to mobilize support for American foreign policy and to demonize the Soviet Union as an enemy of freedom and democracy. In the Soviet Union, it helped to maintain control over the population and to justify the sacrifices and hardships of the communist system. However, propaganda also had its limitations. People were not always willing to accept the messages that were being disseminated, and they often developed their own views and opinions based on their experiences and observations. Moreover, propaganda could be counterproductive, leading to resentment and distrust of the source. The Cold War propaganda battle had a lasting impact on the world. It helped to shape public perceptions of the United States and the Soviet Union, and it contributed to the ideological divisions that characterized the Cold War era. The techniques and strategies that were used during the Cold War continue to be employed today in the battle for hearts and minds in the digital age. Chapter 15: Life Behind the Curtain. The Soviet Experience: Life Behind the Iron Curtain, in the Soviet Union and its satellite states, was a stark contrast to the idealized image of communist utopia that was promoted by Soviet propaganda. While the Soviet Union made significant strides in industrializing its economy and providing basic social services such as healthcare and education, its citizens also faced significant restrictions on their freedoms, limited access to information, and a pervasive sense of surveillance and control. The Soviet system was characterized by a highly centralized, state-controlled economy. The government owned and managed most of the means of production, including factories, farms, and businesses. Economic planning was carried out by central authorities who set production targets and allocated resources. While this system was initially successful in mobilizing resources for industrialization, it also led to inefficiencies, shortages, and a lack of consumer choice. Soviet citizens had limited access to consumer goods and often had to wait in long lines to purchase basic necessities. The quality of goods was often poor, and there was little incentive for innovation or improvement. The black market thrived as people sought to obtain goods and services that were unavailable through official channels. Political life in the Soviet Union was dominated by the Communist Party, which held a monopoly on power. There were no free and fair elections, and dissent was not tolerated. The KGB, the Soviet secret police, maintained a vast network of informers and used surveillance and intimidation to suppress opposition. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were severely restricted. The government controlled the media and used it to disseminate propaganda and to censor dissenting voices. Travel abroad was also restricted, and Soviet citizens were rarely allowed to visit Western countries. Despite these restrictions, Soviet society was not monolithic. There were pockets of resistance and dissent, and many people found ways to express their individuality and creativity within the constraints of the system. Intellectuals, artists, and writers often used subtle forms of satire and allegory to criticize the regime. Everyday life in the Soviet Union was marked by a sense of conformity and collectivism. Individual initiative was discouraged, and people were expected to prioritize the interests of the state over their own. Education was highly valued, and the Soviet Union made significant investments in science and technology. However, education was also used as a tool of indoctrination, and students were taught to accept the official ideology of the Communist Party. The Soviet Union also made significant progress in providing healthcare and social welfare services to its citizens. Healthcare was free and accessible to all, and the government provided generous pensions and social security benefits. However, the quality of healthcare was often poor, and there were significant disparities in access to services between urban and rural areas. Life in the Soviet Union was also characterized by a strong sense of community and solidarity. People relied on each other for support and assistance, and there was a strong tradition of collective action. Despite the hardships and restrictions, many Soviet citizens felt a sense of pride in their country and its achievements. The Soviet experience was a complex and multifaceted one, marked by both progress and repression. While the Soviet Union made significant strides in industrializing its economy and providing basic social services, its citizens also faced significant restrictions on their freedoms and a pervasive sense of surveillance and control. The legacy of the Soviet Union continues to shape the political, economic, and social landscape of Russia and the other former Soviet republics. Chapter 16: Détente when superpowers chose diplomacy. The era of détente, spanning roughly from the late 1960s to the late 1970s, represented a period of relative easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. After decades of intense rivalry and near-constant threat of nuclear war, the superpowers began to explore avenues for dialogue, cooperation, and arms control. Détente was not a complete end to the Cold War, but rather a shift in strategy, as both sides recognized the dangers of unchecked escalation and the potential benefits of limited cooperation. Several factors contributed to the emergence of détente. The Vietnam War had taken a heavy toll on the United States, both in terms of human lives and economic resources. The war had also fueled anti-war protests and social unrest, creating a sense of crisis at home. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was facing its own economic challenges and was eager to reduce military spending. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, highlighting the catastrophic consequences of a direct confrontation between the superpowers. This crisis underscored the need for improved communication and arms control measures to prevent future escalations. The rise of China as a major power also played a role in the emergence of détente. The United States saw China as a potential counterweight to the Soviet Union, and President Richard Nixon made a historic visit to China in 1972, opening the door to diplomatic relations. This shift in the geopolitical landscape created new opportunities for the United States to pursue a more nuanced and flexible foreign policy. Détente was characterized by a series of high-level meetings between American and Soviet leaders, as well as the negotiation of several landmark agreements. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-Y, signed in 1972, limited the number of strategic nuclear weapons that each side could possess. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM Treaty, also signed in 1972, restricted the development and deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems. These agreements were significant because they represented the first concrete steps towards limiting the nuclear arms race. They also created a framework for future arms control negotiations. In addition to arms control, the United States and the Soviet Union also cooperated on a number of other issues, including trade, technology, and cultural exchanges. Détente did not mean an end to the Cold War rivalry. The superpowers continued to compete for influence around the world, and they remained deeply divided on ideological grounds. The Soviet Union continued to support communist movements and regimes in various parts of the world, while the United States continued to oppose Soviet expansionism. However, détente did create a more stable and predictable international environment, reducing the risk of a direct confrontation between the superpowers. It also allowed for greater communication and cooperation on issues of mutual concern. The era of détente came to an end in the late 1970s, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to rise again. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a major turning point, leading to a renewed arms race and a period of heightened Cold War tensions. Despite its limitations and eventual demise, détente represented an important period in the history of the Cold War. It demonstrated that even the most bitter rivals could find common ground and cooperate on issues of mutual interest. It also laid the foundation for future arms control agreements and for the eventual end of the Cold War. Certainly. Below is a comprehensive plan and draft for a historical book as requested. I will first conceive an English title and then provide 8 meticulously crafted book sections under that title, followed by a descriptive, formal introduction and detailed chapters as specified. For clarity, I'll use Cold War history, America, the Soviet Union, and the fight for global influence as the core inspiration for the title, with added nuance. Chapter 17, The Rise of China and a Shifting Balance of Power. In the latter half of the 20th century, few developments have provoked as much strategic recalibration as the rise of China. As the Cold War initially staged its confrontation between two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, the emergence of a third contender unexpectedly reshaped the global order. Though China's position for much of the early Cold War era appeared as that of a subordinate ally to the Soviet Union, tensions and ambitions within the People's Republic were soon to surface, leading to a dramatic shift in the balance of power. China's journey began amid the turbulence that followed the end of World War II. The Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949, led by Mao Zedong, thrust the nation onto the world stage with newfound ideological resolve. The resulting Sino-Soviet alliance was crucial for both communist powers, but beneath the surface lurked deep-seated differences. China, with its rich history and unique understanding of Marxism-Leninism, sought autonomy from Soviet directives, especially as ideological purity and national interests increasingly diverged. The Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s and early 1960s marked a seismic moment in Cold War history. The schism was not merely a contest of personalities between Mao and Khrushchev, but a substantive disagreement over strategy, revolutionary doctrine, and national security imperatives. By the time of the split, the world no longer witnessed a monolithic communist bloc, but a fractured landscape with China and the Soviet Union competing for influence throughout Asia and even further afield. China's positioning was profoundly pragmatic. Recognizing its need for modernization and wary of Soviet intentions, Beijing sought to maneuver diplomatically. The rapprochement with the United States in the 1970s, epitomized by President Nixon's groundbreaking visit, served to underscore China's flexible foreign policy. This realignment reverberated globally, offering the United States a strategic counterweight against Soviet influence and earning China access to economic and technological advances that would fuel its meteoric rise. The implications for the Cold War's balance of power were immediate and far-reaching. China's emerging stance forced both superpowers to re-evaluate their strategies. America capitalized on the split to weaken the communist world, while the Soviet Union found itself increasingly isolated. Furthermore, China's involvement in regional conflicts such as the Korean War and the struggle for Indochina demonstrated its willingness to assert its interests independent of Moscow's dictates. As China's domestic reforms unfolded under Deng Xiaoping, the focus shifted from ideological militancy to economic modernization. The introduction of market mechanisms and the pragmatic opening to foreign investment accelerated China's transformation from an agrarian economy to a burgeoning industrial powerhouse. While the Cold War was drawing to its denouement by the late 1980s, China was positioning itself as a future global competitor. Thus, the rise of China did not merely alter the Cold War landscape, it provided a lasting template for the emergence of new powers in a multipolar world. Today, the legacies of these shifts remain evident. China's trajectory towards international prominence reminds us that the Cold War was never a static contest, but a dynamic, evolving struggle whose undertones reverberate in every corner of the modern era. Chapter 18: The Fall of the Berlin Wall and the Collapse of Communism. The night of November 9, 1989, remains one of the most iconic moments in modern history. As crowds gathered and border guards watched uncertainly, the once impenetrable Berlin Wall, long a symbol of division, oppression, and ideological rivalry, was breached. What ensued was not simply the physical dismantling of concrete and barbed wire, but the unraveling of the communist regimes that had dominated Eastern Europe for decades. The Berlin Wall's construction in 1961 was an overt manifestation of a divided world. It severed families, stifled aspirations, and stood as a daily reminder of the broader Cold War clash between East and West. To the West, the wall symbolized the brutality of Soviet control. To the East, it was a barrier against destabilizing influences. Beneath this structure, however, simmered discontent, economic stagnation, political repression, and the yearning for freedom and dignity. By the 1980s, the pressure on communist governments had reached unbearable heights. Economic inefficiency was pervasive. Technological progress lagged dramatically behind the West, and attempts at reform, such as Hungary's goulash communism and Poland's solidarity movement, were met with resistance. Yet they revealed the limits of centralized control. The Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, sought to address these challenges with the twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Although these reforms were intended to strengthen socialism, they unintentionally destabilized the authoritarian grip across the Eastern Bloc. The events leading to the wall's collapse unfolded rapidly. Peaceful protests blossomed in Leipzig, East Berlin, and Prague as citizens demanded greater freedoms and democratic participation. Leaders who refused to reform found themselves increasingly isolated, and even the Soviet military became reluctant to enforce the old order. International pressure also played a critical role, with Western governments amplifying support for human rights and economic liberalization. With the breach of the Berlin Wall, the floodgates of change were irrevocably opened. Eastern European countries, emboldened by new hopes and swept up in the momentum, quickly cast off their communist governments. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania experienced rapid political transformations, some peacefully, some violently. In every case, the collapse of communist rule left behind a complicated legacy of economic hardship, tentative democracy, and the daunting task of national reconciliation. For the Soviet Union, the wall's fall was more than a symbolic loss. It undermined the ideological legitimacy of the entire system. The myth of inevitability of socialism's triumph over capitalism was shattered. Within months, the Communist Party relinquished its monopoly on power, and by December 1991, the once mighty Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The collapse of communism reverberated globally. Former Soviet republics and satellite states embarked on divergent paths, some embracing liberal democracy and market reforms, others succumbing to instability or authoritarian retrenchment. The long-term effects of this seismic event continue to inform contemporary debates about governance, identity, and the prospects of freedom. In surveying the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of communist power, we are reminded that monumental change often germinates quietly, nourished by hope, struggle, and the quest for dignity. For millions who lived through those upheavals, the legacy is more than historical. It remains a living testament to the enduring human aspiration for liberty. Chapter 19, The End of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's Reforms and Legacy. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 marked the denouement of the Cold War era and permanently altered the international landscape. At the heart of this transformation stood Mikhail Gorbachev, a leader whose bold reforms and visionary leadership catalyzed the end of an empire. The story of Gorbachev's tenure is one of paradox, his commitment to rejuvenating the Soviet system ultimately precipitated its dissolution. Gorbachev's ascension to leadership in 1985 was greeted with both hope and skepticism. The Soviet Union was beset by economic stagnation, inefficient central planning, mounting military burdens, and widespread cynicism. Previous leaders had attempted cosmetic reforms, but Gorbachev recognized that only comprehensive change could avert disaster. His two signature policies, glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, were designed to revitalize the Soviet system, reinvigorate public trust, and restore the nation's place on the world stage. Perestroika began with decentralization, permitting enterprises more autonomy and experimenting with limited market mechanisms. The aim was to increase productivity, incentivize innovation, and modernize the creaking Soviet economy. However, the entrenched bureaucracy resisted change, and inconsistent implementation led to confusion and frustration. Shortages persisted, inflation soared, and popular expectations of rapid improvement went unmet. Glasnost, meanwhile, unleashed a torrent of pent-up frustration and critique. The greater freedom of expression allowed citizens to voice grievances, challenge long-standing injustices, and debate the path forward. Independent media emerged, exposing government failures and shedding light on previously taboo subjects such as the Stalinist purges, the Afghan war, and environmental disasters. This new openness eroded the monopoly of the Communist Party's narrative and fostered an unexpected pluralism. The unintended consequences of reform were profound. As republics within the Soviet Union gained new political space, nationalist movements flourished. Calls for autonomy and independence grew louder, first in the Baltics, later in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and elsewhere. The Communist Party itself fractured, and hardline conservatives staged a coup in August 1991, hoping to reverse the tide. The coup failed, but the damage was irreparable. Within months, republics formally declared independence, and the Union's overarching structure collapsed. Internationally, Gorbachev's policies transformed East-West relations. He pursued arms reduction treaties, withdrew from Afghanistan, and adopted a less confrontational stance towards Europe. His willingness to engage constructively with Western leaders, above all Ronald Reagan, contributed to the atmosphere of détente and ultimately enabled the peaceful withdrawal of Soviet influence from Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's legacy is contested. Many in Russia associate him with the loss of prestige, territorial integrity, and economic security. Yet globally, he is celebrated as the architect of an unprecedented peaceful revolution, one that ended the Cold War without global conflagration. In examining the end of the Soviet Union, what emerges most vividly is the lesson that systemic change, however well-intentioned, can generate consequences beyond a leader's control. Gorbachev's reforms unleashed transformative energies that both dismantled the old order and paved the way for a new, uncertain future. The world we inhabit today continues to wrestle with the legacies of this epochal moment. Chapter 20, Lessons from the Cold War, Power, Fear, and the Future of Peace. With the passage of decades since the Cold War's conclusion, its lessons have assumed a renewed significance in a world confronted by fresh uncertainties. The contest between America and the Soviet Union was not merely an exhibition of military might, ideological confrontation, or geopolitical maneuvering. It was a crucible that revealed the fundamental nature of power, fear, and the perennial quest for peace. The Cold War demonstrated that power, unchecked and unbalanced, can swiftly escalate from rivalry to existential threat. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, reached its zenith in the Cuban Missile Crisis when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Yet paradoxically, it was this very fear, shared by leaders on both sides, that gave rise to mechanisms for restraint, such as hotlines, treaties, and mutual verification processes. The Cold War thus illustrates that both the pursuit and limitation of power are essential for maintaining global equilibrium. Fear played a dual role throughout the era. It was weaponized by regimes intent on controlling populations and motivating loyalty. But it also engendered respect for boundaries, rules, and the grave responsibilities of leadership. The constant anxiety over infiltration, sabotage, and surprise attack bred suspicion and secrecy. However, it also prompted the development of international institutions designed to diffuse tensions, initiatives for arms control, crisis management, and diplomatic engagement. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Cold War lies in the construction of peace. The eventual thaw in superpower relations was not achieved by chance, but by incremental steps, mutual concessions, and the willingness to confront difficult truths. Détente, dialogue, and the accommodation of diversity proved more effective than confrontation and isolation. The experience of living with, rather than eliminating, adversaries offered crucial insights into the management of enduring competition. Today's world presents new challenges: emerging regional powers, technological disruption, resurgent nationalism, and transnational threats. The Cold War's legacy serves as a caution against simplistic analogies. Today's conflicts may echo past dynamics, but they demand novel solutions. The scaffold of peace must be rebuilt again and again through vigilance, compromise, and empathy. In reflecting on the Cold War, we glimpse both the perils of division and the possibilities of reconciliation. The era invites us to explore not just the machinations of states, but the aspirations of peoples yearning for security, dignity, and progress. The future of peace will depend on our willingness to heed the lessons of history, confront our fears with courage, and reimagine the exercise of power for a new epoch. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.